Hi, boys and girls. We have Chapter 14 of School Days According to Humphrey by Betty Birney. Chapter 14 is called Working Together. The next day, I was pleased to see that Phoebe remembered her homework again. I was certainly glad I'd changed the cards to make her a homework collector. Holly seemed really happy being helpful all day long, especially because Mrs. Brisbane kept her busy. Slow Down Simon had slowed down quite a bit because as door and line monitor, he had to wait for the rest of the class to line up. Hurry Up Harry was never tardy after recess or lunch because he had to leave when the others did. And he was never late in the morning either. I guess the Edos still hadn't figured out the living room clock was fast. Be Careful Kelsey was extremely careful when she handed Og out of his tank. "Don't be scared, Og," she said. "I'd never let anything happen to such a special frog like you." Just Joey tidied up my cage again, even though it didn't really need it. When Miss Brisbane came to check on him, she told him he'd done such a good job, she'd let him train all the future animal handlers. Joey was overjoyed. "Did you hear that, Humphrey?" he asked me later. "I'm a trainer now, not just a handler. Miss Brisbane really trusts me." I could see Joey's job was doing him a lot of good. In fact, all of Brisbane's buddies seemed happy with their jobs, except two of them. Tall Paul and Small Paul had worked together to clear the bulletin board, but they still hadn't put anything up there. Miss Brisbane had taken out boxes full of art supplies and paper, maps and posters, but they just couldn't seem to agree on what to put up. Small Paul wanted to make the theme about autumn. Tall Paul wanted to make the theme about animals. Then Small Paul wanted the bulletin board to be about airplanes. Then Tall Paul wanted it to be about cars. "How about airplanes and cars? Transportation," Miss Brisbane suggested. The Pauls didn't think those went together. I thought the two Pauls didn't go together. I had obviously made an unsqueakably bad mistake when I decided to pair them up. "Mrs. Brisbane, I don't think Paul G and I make very good Brisbane buddies," Small Paul told Mrs. Brisbane after lunch on Tuesday. "Maybe you should switch us with somebody else." "You have to learn to work with people who aren't like you," the teacher explained. "You'll have to do it many times in your life." Small Paul looked miserable. "He won't even try." "And what about you? Are you trying?" Miss Brisbane asked. Small Paul didn't answer. "You can do it, Paul," I squeaked from my cage, and Og agreed to be encouraging too. "Boing, boing," he twanged. Mrs. Brisbane looked over at us. "Look at those two. Can you think of two animals who are less alike than Og and Humphrey?" "That's right. He's an amphibian, and I'm a mammal," I agreed. "And yet they share that table and actually seem to enjoy each other's company," Miss Brisbane continued. "He's cold-blooded and I'm warm-blooded," I added. "So I think two boys who are the same age and in the same class and both like things like planes and cars can learn to work together, don't you?" Miss Brisbane certainly made sense to me. "I guess," said Paul. He didn't sound convinced, though. "So give it another try," Miss Brisbane told him. "For Humphrey and Og, okay?" I crossed my toes and hoped they'd try. They did have a chance to work together later in the day, but they didn't talk at all. They just stared down at the boxes of art supplies. Something I hadn't planned for happened next. Miss Brisbane asked Holly to return some playground equipment to Mrs. Wright. There were several bats and boxes of balls. Helpful Holly had a little trouble carrying them all at one time. The bats crashed to the ground. The box tipped over and the balls bounced all over the floor. She picked them up, then admitted she needed some help. "Would you like to ask someone else to help?" Miss Brisbane asked. Holly looked around the room, and I almost fell off my tree branch when she picked Rolling Rosie. The smile on Rosie's face told me she was pleasantly surprised. "I can carry the box in my lap," Rosie suggested. "You can take the bats." "Good idea," said Holly. After they had left, Mrs. Brisbane told the rest of the class, "That's what I like to see in my classroom, working together. That's why I came up with Brisbane's buddies." Small Paul glanced at Tall Paul when he heard those words. I couldn't hear him, but he said something to Tall Paul, who nodded. Soon they were actually talking as they pulled things out of the box. A little later, Small Paul asked, Mrs. Brisbane, can we borrow some of your pictures of the kids in the class and go to the library? We need to scan them into the computer. Miss Brisbane was surprised, but of course she said yes, and wrote a note to Mr. Finch, the librarian. The Pauls were both smiling when they came back. After school, Mrs. Brisbane seemed unspeakably pleased with herself. Just before she left, she came over to our table to say goodbye. Brisbane's buddies seem to be working out, she said, even though I'm still not sure how those cards got switched around. Did Aldo do it? She laughed. You wouldn't tell him if he did. You wouldn't tell on him if he did, which was true. The next morning, Small Paul and Tall Paul together asked Mrs. Brisbane if they could put up their bulletin board during recess. Yes, she said. I just hope Mrs. Wright doesn't find out. She wants all students to get fresh air. Tall Paul laughed, ran over to the window, opened it, and took a deep breath. There, I've gotten my fresh air. Small Paul raced over and did the same thing. Me too, he said. Then they returned to the bulletin board. I made a plan, Small Paul said, showing Tall Paul a piece of paper. I was glad to hear someone else in room 26 made plans besides just me. Tall Paul studied it carefully. That should work, he said. I guess I'll take the top part. Okay, Small Paul replied. I'll take the bottom. I climbed up on the tippy top of my cage to watch as the bulletin board magically came to life. Tall Paul put up letters across the top, reading, Brisbane's buddies, we work together. Meanwhile, in the lower half of the board, Small Paul put up pictures of students Miss Brisbane had taken on the first day of school. The boys had enlarged them on the computer and printed them out. He put them in pairs according to their jobs. Next, Tall Paul put pictures on the upper half of the board. When they got to the middle, they worked together and didn't seem to mind one bit. They worked quickly in order to finish before recess ended. Now add the drawings we did last night, Tall Paul said. Soon the job titles were accompanied by drawings the boys had made depicting each job. For animal handlers, there were excellent drawings of Og and me. Suddenly, I had an awful thought. They won't need 2 animal handlers if they move one of us to room 18, I told Og. Og splashed loudly in his tank. They were angry kinds of splashes. By the time the other students in the room returned, the bulletin board was finished, and it looked great, great, great. All the kids seemed to enjoy having their pictures on the board. I enjoyed having mine up there too. But what I really enjoyed was seeing that my plan worked after all. Small Paul and Tall Paul walked out of the classroom together at the end of the day, talking about getting together with their planes and cars. I don't think either of them noticed that they weren't the same size. Phew, I said to Og. Phew, I said when Og and I were alone again. We did it, but it was a lot of work. Boing, 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 Og agreed. Aldo came in later to clean the room. I'm glad to see you two are still together, he said. Richie told me that Miss Becker said she decided on which classroom pet she wanted. My tummy did a flip-flop. Which one of us? I squeaked. She said it would be a surprise, Aldo added as she swept under our table. She'll tell them tomorrow. Oh, and she said Miss Mac helped her make up her mind. My tummy did a somersault. Miss Mac loved me. So of course she told Miss Becker to pick me. I still miss my old friends from last year. So why did I feel sad about leaving room 26? Aldo spent a long time in our classroom that night because he brought in stacks of extra chairs and left them in the corner. Mrs. Brisbane says she's going to need these tomorrow, he explained. Why did Mrs. Brisbane need more chairs? Was she going to get more students? If so, wouldn't she need a helpful classroom pet more than ever? Later, I made a few more notes in my notebook. Reasons I'm sad about leaving room 26. Leaving Mrs. Brisbane, leaving Og, leaving my new classmates just when I'm starting to like them. I opened the lock that doesn't lock and strolled over to Og's tank. Og, old friend, I think I'm going to be leaving room 26, I said, even though I don't want to. Og bounced up and down so hard, I thought he'd pop off the top of his tank. Boing, boing, boing! I'm sure you'll still help the students with their problems, I said, and I'll come visit you every night. Og calmed down a little. Maybe Mrs. Brisbane will bring another pet in to keep you company, a cold-blooded animal like you. I thought that would make him feel better, but I don't think it did. He dived into the water side of his tank, splashing furiously. I understood. I went back to my cage, but I didn't sleep much that night. My last night in room 26. Humphrey's rules of school. Work together. Please. Chapter 15 is called The Best Class in the World. Bye, guys.